Judge Ethan Coleman had presided over countless trials in his career, but none had felt quite like this. He stared at the defendant in front of him, Malik Johnson, a 19-year-old facing charges of armed robbery and resisting arrest. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation, as if every single person in the room could feel that something big was about to happen. The gallery of spectators murmured among themselves, casting glances toward Malik as he stood by the defendant's table. His posture was unusually confident for someone in his position, and his eyes never wavered from the judge. Malik's demeanor spoke volumes. He was unafraid. Judge Coleman was ready to dismiss the case. To him, Malik was just another teenager caught up in a poor decision. The case seemed simple enough: a robbery, a chase, and arrest. The evidence appeared damning, and in the eyes of most, this was a clear-cut case. But as the trial began, there was something about Malik's presence that didn't sit right with the judge. Malik's hands were in his pockets, and his chin was slightly raised, the kind of defiance that caught the eye. He wasn't just a defendant. He was something more. The charges were serious. But to Judge Coleman, Malik was just another kid in trouble. He didn't expect him to put up any kind of defense. But Malik had other plans. Malik Johnson had never planned on being in a courtroom like this. Raised by his mother, Carla Johnson, who had been a criminal defense attorney for 18 years, Malik had grown up surrounded by the law. He had spent his childhood sitting in courtrooms, learning about the nuances of the justice system, hearing his mother talk about the games played by prosecutors and judges alike. Carla had never sheltered Malik from the harsh realities of the legal world. By the time Malik was 14, he could recite case law from memory and understand trial strategies better than most law students. But none of that seemed to matter when the charges were brought against him. Malik had never expected to be on trial for something he didn't do, especially not in a case as serious as this one. Yet here he was, standing in front of Judge Coleman, with everything on the line. While other teenagers spent their time memorizing sports statistics, Malik spent his time memorizing the intricacies of criminal law. He had listened to his mother's stories about prosecutors who cut corners and defense attorneys who barely tried. He'd seen how the system often favored the powerful over the innocent. But now it was his turn to challenge that system. The prosecution's case seemed solid. The store's security cameras had allegedly captured Malik entering with a weapon. The stolen items were found in his possession, and witnesses had testified to seeing him flee the scene. It was a story that many people would easily believe. To the average person, this case seemed straightforward, and Judge Coleman was ready to close it with a quick conviction. But Malik wasn't average, and neither was this case. The prosecutor, William Hayes, stood up from his seat. Hayes was a man who believed in the power of certainty, someone who had delivered the same speech countless times. He was in his mid-40s, confident, polished, and sure of his victory. His voice, rehearsed to perfection, carried the weight of someone who had won many cases before this one. "Your Honor," Hayes began, his tone commanding attention as he turned toward the jury, "the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Malik Johnson is guilty of armed robbery. The stolen goods were found in his possession. His fingerprints were discovered on the vehicle, and he was caught fleeing the scene." He paused, letting his words settle into the room like a hammer striking an anvil. "We have eyewitness testimony and video surveillance confirming that Malik was the one who robbed the store at gunpoint." The crowd in the gallery shifted uneasily, whispering among themselves. On the surface, the evidence seemed damning. A stolen vehicle, fingerprints, eyewitness accounts. It looked like a case with no holes. Judge Coleman leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. "Go on, Mr. Hayes," he said, his tone flat. Hayes walked toward the jury box, his polished shoes clicking on the wooden floor. "The defense will try to convince you that Malik is just an unfortunate victim of circumstance," he continued, locking eyes with Malik. "But I ask you, what kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room thickened. Every person in the courtroom was hanging on to Hayes' every word. The prosecutor had played his hand, and the room was in agreement. Malik looked guilty. But Malik wasn't just going to sit there and let this happen. Malik remained silent, his expression unreadable, as Hayes' words filled the room. He wasn't surprised by the prosecutor's strategy. He had spent months preparing for this trial. He'd anticipated every move, every argument. He knew the game. Finally, Judge Coleman gestured to the defense. "All right, Let's hear from a defendant, he said. But Malik wasn't ready to speak yet. He let the room sit in silence, allowing the weight of the moment to settle around him. The courtroom was still, the tension palpable. Then, without a hint of hesitation, Malik stood up. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor," he said calmly, his voice steady. The courtroom erupted into a murmur. Even the judge's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "You'll represent yourself?" Judge Coleman asked, the amusement in his voice now replaced by something more serious. Malik's voice remained firm. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe I can handle this myself." The room went completely silent. The prosecutor's smirk faltered just a fraction of a second before he quickly recovered. "Well, this should be fun," Hayes muttered under his breath, clearly underestimating Malik. But Malik wasn't interested in entertaining anyone. This wasn't about him proving something to the courtroom. It was about proving the truth. Malik took a slow step forward, his eyes scanning the room. The silence stretched for just a moment longer, long enough to make everyone in the room uncomfortable. Then, without breaking his gaze from the jury, Malik spoke. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution." Hayes crossed his arms, raising an eyebrow. "Go ahead." Malik stepped forward again, his calm demeanor only making the room feel heavier. "You said Officer Daniels personally saw me behind the wheel of the stolen vehicle, correct?" "That's right," Hayes replied, his voice now betraying the first sign of doubt. "And Officer Daniels' testimony is written in his report?" Malik asked. "Of course," Hayes answered. "Then," Malik said, his tone shifting slightly, "I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence." The room went completely silent. The judge glanced at Hayes, waiting for him to object. But Hayes stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what had just been said. "On what grounds?" Judge Coleman asked. Malik raised his hand, a quiet confidence in his movements. "Because Officer Daniels wasn't even on duty that night." A flicker of confusion crossed Hayes' face. "What do you mean?" he asked. Malik turned to the judge. "If the court will allow it, I request to verify Officer Daniels' GPS logs from the night of my arrest. If he was where he said he was, his GPS data will prove it." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. This was a shift no one expected. Judge Coleman leaned forward, intrigued. "Do you have any objections, Mr. Hayes?" he asked. Hayes hesitated, his jaw tightening. Finally, he shook his head. "No objections, Your Honor." The room went quiet as the GPS data was reviewed. Moments later, the result was clear. Officer Daniels' GPS logs didn't match his story. His location didn't align with the chase he had described. Judge Coleman's eyes widened. This wasn't the clear-cut case everyone thought it was. Malik turned toward the jury, his voice steady. "Now let's talk about the rest of the evidence," he said. "The prosecution wants you to believe that because my fingerprints were on the stolen goods, I must have stolen them. But let's be logical here." He paused, allowing the room to digest his words. "Imagine you walk into a store, try on a jacket, maybe zip it up, and put it back on the rack. Hours later, someone steals the jacket. Would your fingerprints on the jacket mean you stole it?" The room was silent, the tension building. Malik could see the doubt creeping into the jury's faces. The courtroom was still as the GPS logs were reviewed. The data was clear. Officer Daniels had lied. The logs did not match his testimony. The location he claimed to be at was far from where Malik had been arrested. The entire foundation of the prosecution's case began to crumble. Malik's eyes swept the room, settling on the jury. He could see their faces shifting from disbelief to confusion. The tables had turned. The truth was no longer hidden behind a veil of assumptions and lies. Malik wasn't just defending himself now. He was exposing the cracks in the system that allowed those lies to slip through unnoticed. He took a step forward, his posture unwavering. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "I'd like to bring up the other piece of evidence, the fingerprints found on the stolen vehicle." The prosecutor, Hayes, straightened up at the mention of the evidence. He was still trying to regain his composure after the revelation of the GPS logs. "The defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel," Hayes insisted, his voice now tinged with a hint of desperation. "That's the evidence that links him to the crime." Malik nodded. "Yes, my fingerprints were on the steering wheel. But the question is, does that make me guilty of stealing the car?" He paused for effect, letting his words sink into the room. "Let's say you walk into a department store, pick up a jacket, try it on, and walk out without buying it. Then, Hours later, someone steals that jacket. Would your fingerprints on it make you a thief? A few jurors exchanged glances. They were listening now, really listening. Malik's argument was simple, but it was piercing through the cloud of doubt that had been hanging over the case. He continued, I was outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged robbery. I leaned against the car. I even opened the door, but I didn't steal it. I didn't drive it. I didn't take anything from inside. I just happened to touch it. And now, I'm supposed to be guilty of stealing it. Malik's voice was calm, yet every word hit with the weight of truth. The tension in the room was palpable. The jury was looking at him differently now, not as a defendant, but as a young man who had just made them question everything they thought they knew. The room was completely still. Malik's question hung in the air, leaving no room for doubt. If the prosecution couldn't even bring in their own expert, what else had they neglected? Interesting, Malik said quietly, letting the word linger in the room. He turned back to the jury. It's funny, isn't it? How a case so easily built on assumptions can fall apart so quickly. Malik wasn't done yet. He still had more to say, and he wasn't going to let the prosecution get away with anything. You want to know why this case is falling apart? He asked, his voice rising just enough to command attention. Because the system is built on shortcuts. The police made assumptions. The prosecution bought those assumptions. And now we're here, wasting time and resources on a case that was never about finding the truth. He turned toward Judge Coleman, his eyes steady. And the real reason we're here today? Because of the bias in the system. A black teenager was caught near a stolen vehicle, and they assumed it was me. That's the truth. The prosecution didn't look for the truth. They looked for someone to convict. But I'm not that person. The courtroom was silent, but the energy had shifted. Malik had done something that no one expected. He had turned the system's own flaws against it. He wasn't just defending himself. He was exposing the cracks in the legal system for everyone to see. Malik turned back to the jury. I want you to think about the real thief, he said, his voice steady. I wasn't the one who stole the car. I wasn't the one running from the cops. The real thief got away that night. The officers just found a black kid in the area and decided that was enough. They didn't look for the truth. They just looked for someone to blame. Malik let that statement hang in the air. The tension in the room was deafening. For the first time in the trial, the jury was looking at him with new eyes. He wasn't the guilty defendant. They could see that now. He was someone fighting for justice. Judge Coleman leaned forward in his chair, his fingers pinching the bridge of his nose. He was rubbing his temples, the weight of the case now sinking in. He glanced at the jury and then back at Malik. After what seemed like an eternity, Judge Coleman spoke. Case dismissed, he said, his voice firm and final. The courtroom went silent. No one moved for a moment, as if the reality of the verdict had yet to settle in. Then the room erupted, some in disbelief, others in quiet relief. The gallery murmured, reporters scribbled in their notebooks, and the tension in the air seemed to evaporate in an instant. Malik stood still, letting the moment sink in. He had done it. He had taken down the case, piece by piece, with nothing more than the truth. As Malik stepped outside the courthouse, he was met by his mother, Carla, who had been waiting for him at the bottom of the steps. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable. For a long moment, she just stared at him, but finally, she let out a sigh and pulled him into a tight hug. You scare me half to death, she whispered. Malik smiled and pulled back slightly. Had to take a risk, Mom. As the two of them walked down the courthouse steps, Malik couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had happened. This was more than just one case. This was a moment where he had shown the flaws in the system, where he had made the system blink first. Across the street, Judge Coleman watched. His expression was no longer one of arrogance or dismissal. It had shifted to something else, something that looked almost like reflection. He had expected this case to be another routine conviction, but now, he knew this was one he would remember. If this story made you think, share it. The justice system isn't perfect, but we can change it. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more stories that matter. Together, we can make the truth heard.